Greetings, this is dslyecxi, and welcome to another episode of Musings on Serious Fun. Today I'll be talking about one aspect of how the Arma experience has changed over the years for Shakhtak. Player death is one of the best examples of an evolution of an Arma aspect over time. Now, when I'm speaking of death in Arma here, I'm generalizing a few things so that I don't have to be too wordy. Death, for the context of this discussion, is anything that causes you to leave active participation in a mission. This can mean outright dying in-game from a variety of causes, but it also means things like losing connectivity to the server, or having hardware issues like losing sound, crashing a desktop, or similar. The key point is that death is an event that takes you out of active participation. To set the stage for this, let's go way back, all the way to Operation Flashpoint. In the interest of time, I'm going to be speaking in pretty broad generalizations here, and this subject, like most, could be expounded on for hours, but that's not what I want to do right here. Operation Flashpoint was released without multiplayer at all. When it was added, it worked such that people on the server when a mission started, that was it. There was no joining in progress. If you died in a mission, you were spectating until the next one happened. And if you weren't in the mission in the first place, you'd be waiting around outside the game until the next one started slotting. For something like a game of Capture the Island, you might start as a 7 versus 7, but find people crashing out or disconnecting over the course of it, which would typically cause asymmetry that would spoil the experience. Moving on to Arma 1, joining in progress became a thing, but it took time for it to be handled properly from a scripting perspective, and the game itself wasn't in the best shape to begin with. You might be able to join in progress for a mission, you might at least be able to join and spectate, but server stability issues might also cause a lock to occur that would force you to sit out until the next mission. Since Arma 1 wasn't exactly the most stable game, someone crashing in a mission often didn't have the luxury of rejoining into it to resume their experience. Missions had to be designed to account for this as well, since a key player asset suddenly being lost could unbalance them or even make them become unachievable. Arma 2 was where this started to change more significantly. Joining in progress, aka JIP, was generally viable, and over time Shakhtak was able to introduce framework features that made it easier for someone to rejoin a mission or join one in progress if needed. It wasn't a perfect process, and server performance sometimes made it non-viable, but it was in a much better state than the prior games in the series, and it got better after DayZ was released and gave Bohemia more incentive to fix up their network code. There were projects that we attempted during the later years of our Arma 2 time to try to smooth out this process, and they went reasonably well and made for some memorable situations. Now, Arma 3 was where this became more or less perfected for us. Joining in progress was a reliable breeze. Our framework was refined to allow you to reinforce people from spectator easily or rejoin in place if you'd gotten armored or similar, and that aspect of the game, the penalty of death, was altered as a result. So given all of that, the penalty for death has lessened as the series has gone on. It was severe in Flashpoint, pretty significant in Arma 1, a consideration in Arma 2, and particularly post-DayZ, but it's a mostly solved aspect in Arma 3, at least for how we do things. I think most communities can say that as well. So if the penalty for death has changed over time, it stands to reason that things linked to that have changed as well. And they certainly have. A really good example of this is friendly fire. Of course, friendly fire is something you always want to avoid, and when you're playing with people that you have a communal bond with, realizing that you took someone out of their experience through a moment's mistake is a pretty unpleasant feeling. In Arma, the capacity for someone to friendly fire is determined by their role and all that comes with it. A member of a fire team is generally going to be backstopped by other members of that team, with people quickly chiming in if it seems like one person became confused and engaged in the direction of friendlies. This is essentially face-to-face rapid communication simply by virtue of how fire teams work. A friendly fire incident can quickly be corrected, and the team leader has a lot of control over preventing them in the first place. This is usually in the form of positioning the team, maintaining awareness of other elements, communicating that to team members, and directing the team's fire. This all changes with vehicle assets. Not only does the communication structure shift significantly, but the distance and lethality increase as well. Communication becomes intra-crew through intercoms, and then anything else is handled in typically one of two radio nets, one dedicated to the type of asset, like aircraft, and another for the ground unit being supported, typically the platoon net of that element. While the vehicle or aircraft commander is still influential and can exercise control over the gunner's engagements and assist with situational awareness, mistakes can still happen for both of them. The power and range of vehicle weaponry, combined with the tiered nature of communications, means that you can easily end up with a scenario where a friendly element is engaged by friendly fire, in a way that either cuts off their communication with the next higher element, such as having a squad leader get killed or unconscious, or the lethal nature of the engagement means that a check fire call won't be passed up to the relevant radio net until the damage has already been done. And of course, this is assuming ideal conditions as well. Special circumstances might make this even worse. When you factor in the game in question, as well as the asset being chosen, you start to see how incidents in earlier games were more significant than in later ones, and how powerful assets could amplify that damage substantially. What this has meant for Shack Tech over the years is that we expected our vehicle crews in particular to be exceptionally good at avoiding friendly fire. The consequence of friendly fire was really severe for a very long time, and having that expectation meant that anyone taking a role that was more of a potential liability, like an attack helicopter, a jet, tank, or something like that, needed to understand they were being asked for peak performance because the experience of other members of our community could be significantly negatively impacted if they didn't. It became a rule that if you friendly fired as a vehicle asset, you'd need to write a post about it to detail what happened and what the lessons learned were. This was simply enforcing accountability. If someone wanted to play with a cool toy, they need to treat their role with respect and be accountable for their action. Accidents happen, and that's okay, but negligence was to be avoided. There was a point post-DayZ where we were doing co-ops with around 100 players in them, and when combined with Arma's netcode at the time, we often were put in the position of not being able to rejoin people if they died or lost connection, as it could potentially destabilize the server. These missions could last 2 hours or more, and we found ourselves in the position of having to keep the server locked and prevent people from rejoining after death, disconnect, or similar. Friendly fire became that much more serious of a concern. Friendly fire wasn't common, and we were generally good about it, but there were times where people slipped up. One that stands out in my mind was a mission in which an attack helo gunner failed to possibly ID some targets midway through a mission, and ended up completely wiping out the remnants of a friendly squad as a result. About 8 people killed. I remember seeing the names of some of those players suddenly disconnect in frustration after it happened, and this was painful not from an in-game or in-universe standpoint, but rather from seeing the members' experiences degraded in a community that was meant to bring them enjoyment, one which I was ultimately responsible for. When something like this happened in a high death severity context, the response to it tended to be different than otherwise. The greater the responsibility, the more preventable the incident, the more people affected by it, the more significant it would become. In that specific incident, I contacted the attack helo's gunner the day after the mission in private, wanting clarity on what had happened and letting them know what needed to be done after such an event. They posted a detailed breakdown of the situation in our After Action Review forum, apologizing for it and explaining what had happened from their perspective. They were sincere, they did the things they were asked for after such an incident, and of course they didn't want that to happen again. Now, naturally, neither did I. And this is where it becomes a good of the many calculation. One of those things you can find yourself having to assess when you're in a leadership position for a community. In the context of the group at that time, from an administrative perspective, I wasn't willing to risk them in that role and jeopardize other people's fun. Their mistake cost members an experience, and I was ultimately responsible for that, and for fixing it. Limited or special assets are something that's earned through performance, and a failure to perform that negatively influenced the better part of a squad's worth of players at a time when so many people were vying for the opportunity to take an attack helo role meant that this member would need to stick to other things for a time. Other people needed a chance to shine. Now, of course, it's just a game at the end of the day, but there are still consequences to actions taken in it. When we were in that high death severity state, it was that much more important for people to be accountable, proficient, and careful. What happened with that helo gunner back in Arma 2 was a necessity of the times because we had no way to get those afflicted players back in the game, and they lost out on a potentially memorable experience as a result. They were essentially punished for something that wasn't their fault, and there wasn't anything I or the other admins at the time could do to fix it on the spot. In lieu of a better means of dealing with it, we had to give people opportunities to perform, but also hold them accountable if they significantly slipped up. Now, it's worth noting that the way I'm talking about this particular Arma 2 incident now is years removed from the intensity of stress that tended to surround me back in those days of really explosive Shack Tech growth in that immediate aftermath of DayZ. At the time, I was pretty pissed. I was blunt, and I was terse. I felt bad for those who'd lost out on the mission. I felt responsible for what had happened to them, and I took the actions needed to prevent it from happening again and give time for reflection and self-improvement. The important part here was that criticism was in private, not public. That's something that's worth talking about in detail some other time, but the short version is simply that if you're going to criticize someone or hold them accountable in a charged environment like that, it should be done in private. This person wasn't raked over the coals in public. They owned up to what happened, they apologized, and they were sincere. And ultimately, they were accountable for it. And there were no hard feelings about it. That person is still a member, and they've been with us for well over a decade at this point. Another example from that era would be the time a newer player shot a friendly logistics vehicle while gunning for an IFV. This stood out as egregious for two main reasons. The first was that the Logi vehicle was clearly not a threat. It was obviously unarmed, and it appeared as an ammo truck, not a troop-carrying one. We hadn't been engaging in anything like that leading up to the incident. It was a briefed element, and we'd all had plenty of time up to that point to become familiar with our supporting assets in that mission. The other aspect was that Logi is typically a non-combat and fairly selfless role that involves dedicating their time and effort towards doing things to help the team. It feels particularly bad to have someone selflessly helping others end up being shot by those same others out of negligence. While destroying that vehicle only took one person directly out of the action, it was an important person, filling an important and welcomed role, and the loss would influence others. Since we were mid-mission at the time, and that was a pretty impactful lack of judgment and positive ID, I called for the gunner to be replaced. After a moment, I had an idea, since I was crewing a vehicle that at the time only had myself and a driver in it. I decided to have the at-fault gunner come over and gun for my vehicle, which would give me an opportunity to better control their fires and mentor them for the remainder of the mission. However, before any of this could happen, that vehicle is knocked out and destroyed in what we would call an act of battlefield karma. That gunner owned up to what they did, and they went on to be a fine member of ShackTech. They've been in the group for almost a decade at this point. So these days, thanks to the evolution of the core game, as well as the efforts at modding it more to our preferences, there's rarely a high death severity situation like that Helo gunner one. Smaller scale incidents like the Logi truck being friendly fired are basically a non-factor these days and can quickly be rectified. Friendly fire is still significant and something to be avoided, but if it happens, we can get those affected back into the mission quickly and allow them to pick up from where they left off. We, and I mean all of us, myself included, still do write-ups if we slip up and FF someone in a vehicle, or if we have some kind of Helo incident. It still has meaning. It's just that now, thankfully, the cost of those sorts of incidents in terms of actual player satisfaction of that session is no longer high. These days, we can fix it if we have the technology. The same general thing goes for other mass casualty situations. If we have an entire squad wiped out by some fluke happenstance early in a mission, we're able to reinforce them as a new element not too long after that, giving them an opportunity to try again and continue to have an experience. Once you transition to the later stages of a mission, it's a little different, since at that point, that sort of reinforcing is no longer appropriate, which in turn makes every death a much more permanent affair and something where your remaining mission experience is likely to consist of cheering on the enemy AI with your fellow ghosts as they try to take on the remnants of player forces. It's a different kind of fun. So death matters, but if it's earlier in a mission, or it seems like it was something unintended, like friendly fire, getting disconnected, or having an early high lethality event wipe out many people, it makes a lot more sense to get those members back into action, rather than force them to sit out an hour or more worth of additional gameplay. Generally speaking, you don't sign up for a group because you want to sit around and do nothing. For those of you running a community of some sort, or planning to, the takeaway from this, in my view, is that the strictness of guidelines and the expectations of players should be based on the consequences of failures to follow those guidelines, or what a player might do by not living up to the expectations. This isn't about winning a mission, or mimicking how the military handles a given kind of problem, or being pedantic or inflexible on how death is handled. It's about the group experience first, the collective body of players in a given scenario, and then after that, it's the individual experiences. Whether the mission is a victory or not is almost completely irrelevant because there's no significant correlation as to how the end state relates to the potential for great times and memorable experiences leading up to that point. Personally, I am infinitely happier these days to have so many ways to get people back into the action and ensure that nobody's sitting out from a sour experience with friendly fire, temperamental crashing, or anything of that sort. The pre-Arma 3 years were much more demanding in a very unenjoyable kind of way when it came to trying to ensure as many people could have a good experience as possible. It was often incredibly stressful, and I don't miss that at all. Arma 3 and what we've modded into it over the years has largely taken that kind of stress away, both for the players choosing to take those kinds of high-value assets, as well as those of us in an administrative capacity who are putting in the hours to make sure everyone has a good time. So remember that as an admin or a game master, the mark of a successful mission isn't how the mission objectives are or aren't met, but instead lies in ensuring that as many people as possible can walk away from it having had a positive experience with their friends. So there you go. That's a look at death over the course of the Arma series. That'll do it for this one. If you have a question of your own, feel free to post it in the comments and I'll consider it for the future. There's a pretty substantial backlog already, but there's no limit to how long a backlog can be. Thank you for your time and for listening, and until next time, take care.